Our next session features Andrew Hoganson, Consumer Goods, Retail, and Logistics Practice Head at Infosys. Andrew brings over 30 years of experience in the retail, consumer goods, and logistics space, as well as the high-tech industry, working with market leaders like Accenture, EY, and currently Infosys. Much of Andrew's recent thought leadership has centered around helping supply chains in retail and other industries manage the unprecedented disruptions that have been the hallmark of the past 18 months. From the pandemic to the Suez Canal blockage to winter storms across the southern US, the resilience of supply chains have definitely been tested worldwide as of late. So I'm excited to have you here to help shed light on this topic for us, Andrew. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for having me on.
Great. So let's get started. What are some of the most damaging impacts of supply chain disruptions?
Well, there are quite a few, but let's just start with thinking about the impact to jobs, right? So when you think about these disruptions, they often can shut plants down, can disrupt distribution centers and the flow of goods, which means people are losing their jobs or temporarily furloughed. So that's one. Another one is you think about the impact on these companies, right? Companies that are not getting the sources that they need to supply to manufacture products or not able to fulfill orders to their customers. So now we're talking about impacting their revenues and their ability to meet their requirements for Wall Street.
Yeah.
It also, interestingly, can impact our ability to address climate crisis because when we have shortage of supply of some of these raw materials, and manufacturing techniques, now we're forced to go to alternative methods that maybe aren't as climate friendly. So we have that. And then also you can get to a point where this starts to impact balance of trade between countries. And even as far as national security, when you think about the crisis right now relative to the shortage of chips. And then I'd say lastly, obviously this all comes to bear at the consumer, right? So it impacts the consumer in terms of availability of the products and the cost of those products as well.
Yeah. And I think we've all felt that recently, globally, right? I've been hearing about shortages in the UK, shortages in North America. And it's interesting that you talk about national security because I've also heard that coming up a lot more as well because of the shortages or some of the shortages that we do have. So I'm glad that you brought that up. Do you think that the Biden administration's recently established task force to evaluate and address global supply chain disruptions will make an impact? I know there's a lot of supply chain leaders that are talking about this. They're excited about this because supply chain is really getting, visibility right now. But what do you think?
Yeah, no, I definitely think it could have an impact. I mean, when you take the resources of the government, right, whether those resources are monetary in nature, whether it's their ability to relax policies or restrictions on industries, coupling that with the innovation of industries, of companies and their thought leadership about, what could we do differently, I think really can have a multiplying effect on our ability to address some of these supply chain disruptions. And then additionally, this puts this, from an international or global perspective, if it's on the agenda for the Biden administration, then it's going to be on the international agenda as well, meaning, other world leaders and what do we need to do around trade balance, around collaborating globally to, resolve these disruptions. So absolutely, I think they'll have the ability to have a bigger impact than we would if they didn't move forward with something like this.
Absolutely. I'm excited to see where this goes. And like you said, collaboration globally. I mean, that is something that we've needed in supply chain for so long. We talk about collaboration internally. We've talked about collaboration externally. And now we're looking at it from a global standpoint and from a government level. And like you said, the resources behind that is really going to be able to drive things forward that maybe we haven't been able to do in the past. So what is the number one most critical capability for retail supply chains to remain agile in response to disruption today? I mean, this is probably one of the most important questions that
Oh
I
yeah.
need to ask you because it seems like disruptions are coming up every couple of days. I mean, recently you had Yantian, you also had Kaohsiung, so what can they do to remain agile?
You're right. It is probably the most important question. It's one all of our clients are asking us now, right? As they
Hmm.
look at the impact it's had historically, knowing that it's not going away, they're asking that question of how do I get prepared? How do I do a better job of managing these disruptions? And really, if you get at the core of it, I would say it's a combination of three things. One is having an infrastructure, a technology infrastructure that allows for the capture and use of volumes of data, right? So data on where inventory is, data on goods movement, data on demand, data on supply, right? Sources. So I'd say one is that data, having access to that. I think secondly is having intelligence built into your planning solutions. So we need
Yes.
to migrate away from just the basic, and when I say basic, I don't mean they're not sophisticated, but the traditional planning systems that are based off of algorithms that look at historical data. We really need to embed intelligence in those that makes them continuously learning, evolving, ability to interpret what they're seeing, provide context with the data. And then lastly, I would say you need to couple that with control tower / visibility capability, something that allows you to see actively what's happening in your supply chain. So whether it's a ship getting caught in a storm, whether it is a weather pattern or weather event that's going to disrupt supply, whatever it is, right? When you couple all of those together, now you can create an environment where, first of all, you can sense the disruption earlier, right?
Yes.
So if I get earlier notification of the fact that there is a disruption, that's step one. Step two is then I can understand the impact of that disruption, right? So it's one thing to know there's a disruption. It's another thing to know that, hey, this is going to shut my plant down and therefore I'm going to be short of these finished goods to supply to these customers, or, whatever that true impact is. Third, then the intelligence layer comes in and allows you to do some what if and come up with some ideas of what are my alternatives, right? Now that this disruption's happening, what alternatives do I have to resolve this or mitigate the impact?
Hmm.
And then lastly, and probably most importantly, is the layer that allows you to actually execute on a chosen alternative. So it's one thing to say, I sense a disruption, I understand the impact, I've now come up with a viable alternative, but you absolutely have to have the ability to execute on that, whether it's reallocating inventory, redirecting goods in transit, whatever that is, finding alternative sources of supply of raw materials or work in progress, and direct those to your factories or your plants. So backing up to the beginning, then it really does come down to having the access to the data,
Hmm.
having the intelligence built into your planning solutions that knows how to take that data contextually and come up with alternatives and understand what the impacts are, and then having the visibility so that you get early sensing of what's going on.
Absolutely. And I love all of that because I think each one of them has a sense of importance in that string of strategy, right? And strategic thinking. And where do you go from one to the next? And what do you need to think about in the end? So, we've all talked about how the last 18 months has just been full of challenges and different things like that. But how have challenges and capabilities evolved over the past 5 to 10 years, right? We've all been focusing on the last 18 months, but what about going back as far as 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so I'd say, first of all, I'd say that there's two halves of that equation. One is what's happening on the impact of these disruptions, and on that end, I would talk first about customer expectations. Clearly, consumer expectations have risen
Yes.
significantly, right? When you
Mhm.
think about the fact that people have complete transparency to product availability, pricing, what's in my product, right? Whether it's food and what's the origin of that food, or
Mhm.
where my product was made, et cetera. So that transparency, that service level expectation that we've come to expect now around same day, next day availability, best price, et cetera. So that's made these impacts or the disruptions much more impactful, right? Because there's a higher expectation.
Mhm.
Secondly, you think about the fact that companies for years have been focusing on efficiencies and driving costs down. Well, what that's done is that's taken a lot of the excess capacity or fat out of our supply chains. Whether that's we've reduced the amounts of inventories we're carrying, we've
Yep.
cut down on lead times, we've trimmed and trimmed and trimmed to the point where now a disruption has a much more immediate effect
So
on
true.
our final objectives, because we don't have that excess capacity, those safety stocks, those excess cushion in our lead times. So now the disruption will have a much more immediate impact on us. So that's on the, how are these disruptions having a bigger effect on us today than they were, say, 5 years ago? In terms of capabilities, I think there's several things there, right? Obviously, the availability of intelligent solutions. So when we think about machine learning embedded inside of planning engines, AI, RPA, right? Solutions that can build that intelligence in automatically is a newer technology. Secondly, you think about not only the availability of data, right? So again, things like real-time inventory data, where do I have it, how much, what's the state of it, demand data, and then the event data around the world. That is much more available today than it has been in the past. Some of that is infrastructural in nature, right?
Yeah.
So when we think about how prevalent GPS is or RFID or other IoT type instrumentation that's out there now in our supply chains collecting data, real time. So that data is there. And then lastly is the compute power via the cloud to process that data. So those things really, again, have really evolved significantly over the last several years to give us a better capability to address these disruptions that we didn't necessarily have back then.
Absolutely. Being proactive instead of reactive, like we have been in the past. So let's talk about visibility. Visibility is talked about a lot these days. I've heard that word so many times over the last couple of months. What role does visibility play in retailers' technology toolbox?
Yeah, and as we said earlier, right, visibility is really the key first step in addressing disruptions. If you don't have the ability to detect those disruptions early, your ability to respond and mitigate the impact reduces significantly.
Yeah.
So visibility and knowing that something's happening, again, it could be climate events, it could be, a storm that's caused ships to lose containers, it could be the Suez Canal blockage, it could be a variety of things, right? But having that immediate visibility anywhere in your network of what's going on and what is out of the norm is a very important thing to be able to address the disruption more effectively. Additionally, visibility gives us the data we need to identify the alternatives, right? So
Yeah.
it's one thing to say, I know something happened, but if I want to know what are my alternatives, I need to have visibility to where everything else is in my supply chain, right?
Yeah.
Where are other containers? Where are there power units? Where is other inventory? If I want to move things around and make, alternative plans. So it's not just visibility to the disruption itself, but then it's visibility to all my other assets, inventory, et cetera, to be able to come up with alternative plans to how to do that, repositioning equipment, reallocating inventory, et cetera.
So important. So let's talk a little bit about the future. What do you expect to see in the future? What do we have to look forward to?
Well, one thing that I think is really evolving now, it's early stages, right? But we're just starting to see it evolve, is a lot more collaboration between CPG companies, suppliers, logistics companies, and the retail customers, right? That collaboration is really forming what we consider kind of marketplaces, where there's a much higher degree of collaboration between those players around what inventories do they have, what demand are they seeing, what's going on in their networks, and that information sharing, that collaboration to create a marketplace allows for a much more quick and much more diverse way of addressing disruptions that happen, right? So if all I'm able to do is look at my own inventory, my own network, my own assets, and when a disruption happens, I am somewhat limited in what I'm able to do. I'm also somewhat limited in my understanding of the impact and how to get around this disruption. But now when I start collaborating with my retail partners, my wholesale manufacturers, my logistics partners, collaborating on things like, share more inventory data with me about what you have, share about where your containers are, shipping company, share what you're seeing around demand. When we see that collaboration going on, that really drives better performance for all the players. So it really becomes a thing about moving away from these competitive barriers that have always existed where, well, I can't share information with you because, I've got to protect my margin data, or I've got to protect, I've got to keep my walls up a little bit because yes, you're my customer, but I don't want to open the kimono completely. Or even we're seeing it between competitors where, they're starting to let a little bit of those walls down because they're realizing that the effect they can have on the overall industry, on their own individual performance is much, much bigger, and they have much better results when they do collaborate like that. And again, I think back to the question about the Biden administration coming out with this task force is a great example they're leading by example of, we all need to figure this out together, right?
Yes.
This isn't any one individual company's responsibility to figure out just for themselves. We have to work together to figure this out, ultimately with the goal of trying to drive better deals for consumers on costs, drive, quality of living up, better jobs, and address the climate, right? Obviously, if we can do this better and start to get after these disruptions, that could obviously also have a positive impact on climate control.
Andrew, you are speaking my language. I love that you're talking about collaboration. I mean, collaboration is truly the way forward. We hear that over and over again from conversations across many different industries and functions. And to your point, having that technology to make it happen, to give you the ability to communicate with partners upstream and downstream to plan ahead is key to operationalizing it. I love all of this. I love what you were saying in this conversation. Collaboration really is the key. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you
Absolutely.
all for joining us today.